Don't do what I used to do, which is walk around bitter and enraged at all of the incorrect English being spoken by my fellow English speakers. Don't do it, because it's, again, fine. Have you ever heard somebody say a whole nother? For a long time, this bothered me, and I didn't really think that much about it until I looked into it. Why did it bother me? Because in my mind, I thought the correct thing to say is a whole other. That's a whole other issue. That makes sense, right? A whole other thing. So usually we use it to say, don't focus on that, we don't need to focus on that, or that's a separate thing that we don't need to think about at the moment, right? And so I've always tried to use whole other, but I'm surrounded by whole nother. And in my mind, I always thought that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. That's slangy sounding. It's wrong. So I'm not going to use it. And surely it's a modern thing. Uneducated people. But I was wrong. When I actually looked into it, I found that nother goes all the way back to perhaps the 15th, 16th century. People were using nother. And I believe around the 18th century, people started using whole nother. Whole nother. Not whole other. Whole other is, yes, correct, but whole nother. Sounds strange. What's going on here? So we're going to explore it a little bit, talk about the variations of it and how it is used. And to do that, we'll go over to the blackboard. So here we are. And the actual correct way that we should write this is to put a little apostrophe here in front of nother. If we're going to make it correct, we'll get there. But the reason for that is that we have the here and then nother. And actually, the whole is in the middle of the two. Now, you often won't see it written that way. You'll often just see it written like this, nother, if you see it written. The reason you won't see it written very often is that it is still considered sort of casual, slang sounding English, right? And that's why I always had that impression, I think. I always thought this is wrong, this is incorrect. But I found out it's not wrong, it's not incorrect. It's just another thing. And we can class it with casual, but still it is English. Okay, so let's do 3 examples here and explore the differences. Then we'll get into how we can actually use nother if we're going to. I think I probably still won't. You're talking about another level of wealth. You're talking about a whole other level of wealth. You're talking about a whole nother level of wealth. Now here I have the little apostrophe there. I could do without it, but let's put that aside for a moment. Okay, is there any difference between these 3? So another level doesn't really emphasize it very much. It's not that strong. It doesn't give us a sense of, wow, that's very different, right? The difference between someone who has $10 million and someone who has $100 billion or $200 billion like Jeff Bezos, that's another level of wealth. Well, if we just say another makes us feel like it's just one more, right? What if we want to emphasize it? There are different ways we could do it. We could say that's a completely different level of wealth. That is an absolutely different level of wealth. And there are ways to do that, right? Now, if we wanted to make it grammatically correct and perfectly acceptable, even in writing, we could say you're talking about a whole other level of wealth. And this whole here gives it emphasis. It makes it stronger, right? So that's fine, except when you walk around out there among native English speakers, I remind you, we're not talking about non-native English speakers here. You're walking around, you hear a lot of people still saying whole nother, whole nother, whole nother. But what you also always hear is the in front of it. So what you may more often see written down is a whole other level of wealth. That will be more written English and spoken. If you're talking to me, for example, I like to use that one. Or if you're walking around just listening, you'll hear a lot of a whole nother level of wealth. Don't do what I used to do, which is walk around bitter and enraged at all of the incorrect English being spoken by my fellow English speakers. Don't do it, because it's, again, fine. Now, we don't really need to worry about this apostrophe here because it doesn't usually need to be written down because it is considered casual still. It's informal speech. It's considered, it's not slang so much, but just spoken English. Okay. Now the always accompanies it because it's part of the structure. We don't say whole nother. We have to say a whole nother if you're going to say it. That always goes with it. And that's why you have the apostrophe there, because it's a split. It's a way of splitting another, right? The and then whole nother to emphasize it instead of just saying another, okay? So that's the idea. Now let's just do a couple of simple examples. That's a whole nother issue. Okay, that's a whole nother thing. Why is a whole nother can of worms? Now, these are each different. That's a whole nother issue is problem, topic, thing we're talking about, right? That's a whole nother thing is maybe asking someone to not think about that right now. Let's focus on what we're talking about. Don't think about the other thing right now. You're thinking another thing. Let's not think about that too much. Why is a whole nother can of worms? Now, you would want to say this emphasizing why. Why is a whole nother can of worms? Now, this is very spoken English sounding, not written English sounding. It's sort of like saying the reason why, we can consider it like this. The reason why is a whole nother can of worms. Can of worms means messy issue. And again, it's kind of saying there's another topic that we don't need to discuss right now, or we don't need to worry about right now. Let's not focus on it. That's a whole nother can of worms. Let's focus on this thing. And that is how it's usually used. Again, remember, it's more spoken English, but when you hear it, remember, it's been around for hundreds of years, so it is fine to use. And I was wrong for feeling so frustrated for so long about whole and nother.